Thank you so much for joining us for this very special event as part of the 100th anniversary celebrations of the Anglican Diocese of Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. And the theme is yesterday, today, tomorrow, celebrating service, guarding justice, and affirming hope. I'm your moderator, claim that I am a member of the Anglican Church, and to further buttress my credentials by saying my mother was an Anglican deacon and my stepfather an Anglican priest. I think it's so wonderful that the diocese has chosen to include its celebrations. It's deeply interested with confronting the church's past history with enslaved and looking to the future, looking forward to introducing them to you in just a little bit. But before that, I'd like to ask to come up and speak to us and deliver the welcome, Archbishop Howard Gregory.
Good morning. I would like to welcome all of you, whether physically present or online, to this webinar as part of the series of activities designed to mark the observance of the 200th anniversary of the establishment of this Diocese. Sharing reflections on the theme of slavery and reparatory justice. Doing so, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Ms. Dawn Jackson, who is our moderator for this event, the distinguished individuals who have agreed to be presenter panelists, and who will be introduced by her in a more fulsome way. The representatives of the University of the West Indies, who have been very supportive of this initiative, the media, and to all of you who constitute our audience today. It is clear to us in the diocese that while some academics have been publishing and speaking on the subject, and CARICOM has its 10-point reparations plan, there has not been sufficient public education and sensitization around the issue of reparatory justice. Consequently, there is a perception among many that the subject is simply about money, when it will come, in what form, who will be paying, and who will be the recipients of this cash flow. One may ask why the church chose such a topic for this event. We must acknowledge as Anglicans that the coming of the Church of England to the Caribbean in the 17th century was part of a transplantation of an imperialistic and colonizing movement on the part of Britain, intended to serve the interests of the plantocracy, while regarding the Black population, which then consisted of the enslaved, as mere private property, not worthy of evangelization and the ministry of the church. This webinar will inevitably focus on the experience of enslavement, its cruelty and dehumanizing lasting impact on the life of the enslaved and their descendants over many generations, and what reparatory justice could mean, and what expression would it take for our contemporary generations. So yes, we will discuss the inhumanity of the experience of enslavement. We will mention monetary expressions of reparatory justice, but it still remains the pain and hurt which slavery implanted and which still lingers, waiting to be engaged and addressed. Our biblical and theological tradition is very clear in speaking to how such broken relationships are handled. Healing cannot be something in which the offender engages by mere self-reflection and then assumes that the matter is resolved. There needs to be an acknowledgement of wrong that has been done, an expression of apology, regret, an expression of reparation, even as forgiveness is in the end the prerogative of the offended or victim and not the perpetrator, if there is to be healing and reconciliation. Having said that, I invite us to pray. Let us pray. O God of justice and compassion, you have created and declared every human life valuable and deserving of respect, because every life is made in your image. We all have equal value, we all have purpose, and we are all part of your plan. Father, you know the injustice that has been inflicted on our ancestors for centuries in our Caribbean context through the evil of chattel slavery. Help us never to forget or offer excuses for the injustices that have happened to so many, and make it clear to all who have benefited or been enriched by this crime against humanity to see the wrong that has been done to your valuable and worthy children. O God, you are the author of justice. We ask that you would rain down justice in the form of convictions, transformed mindsets and hearts, and continued initiatives toward reparation and reconciliation. Help us to look to you and your word to remind ourselves of what justice should look like. You know what injustice is like, God. Every sin committed is an injustice against you. Lord, help us to fight injustice in the right way, and may we always look to you as the solution. O Lord, may hearts be transformed by your grace, and may this time of reflection in this webinar on injustice produce opportunities for conversation to talk about your grace, mercy, and forgiveness. We offer our prayers in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Archbishop. You know, one of the interesting things about this topic is how it has developed and grown, and all the people who are now talking about reparatory justice. I mean, 20 years ago, when you were having this conversation, people were saying, well, what is that? And there were many people scoffing at the idea that anyone would ever buy into this idea of reparatory justice. And yet here we are now, from Glasgow University's plan to set up with the University of the West Indies, the Glasgow Caribbean Centre for Development Research, as part of its move to establish reparations, to a report just this week in Newsweek magazine about the number of states in the USA that are now seriously considering proposals for reparation, to the former BBC presenter Laura Trevelyan, who, on discovering her family's history and connection to enslavement, is now herself a campaigner for reparatory justice, and also has in fact donated money as part of that trust. So when we say people in the Caribbean and Jamaica are in fact leaders in this worldwide movement, it's not at all an exaggeration. And as I mentioned, the panel here for you today is absolutely fantastic. I'm going to be introducing them one at a time as they come up to speak. Each presenter will have 15 minutes to speak. We will have Q&A at the end. However, I will take one or two questions after each presenter, and then we can also go into an extended Q&A at the end of all the presentations. I'll start with Professor Patrick. No, I beg your pardon. I will in fact start with the Most Reverend Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the symbolic head of the worldwide Anglican Church, under whose leadership the Church is moving to address its part in having taken part and having links with the evils of enslavement, and who has helped to set off this absolutely wonderful global conversation on the importance of the Church participating in the reparatory justice movement. Archbishop. Yes.
thank you, Archbishop Gregory, for hosting this discussion here in the extraordinary and illustrious surroundings of the University of the West Indies, and especially to Mrs. Dion Jackson-Miller for your moderation. I feel very humbled to be here in Jamaica among such prestigious and preeminent experts in the field of enslavement and its history and reparatory justice. And I know that I have a great deal to learn, and I have no doubt that I will learn a lot this morning. I want to thank also Professor Patrick Bryan, Professor Vereen Shepherd, Judge Patrick Robinson, and Krzysztof Adamiak for your contributions, to which I look forward. The work you are doing Repair Fund has served as a lightning conductor for the detractors of the church. Accusations in the press and in Parliament aimed at a number of us, especially myself, of kowtowing to pressure have followed. And we have also seen the growth of a culture war over contested heritage, monuments, and statues, which now have become objects of attack or defense. This is especially true of memorials to those who made their money from slavery, money later donated to institutions like university, colleges, hospitals, schools, and so on. The fund from the church commissioners carefully is structured to obey charity law, but also to ensure that an advisory committee is able to have a powerful role in the allocation of the impact investments it will create, has led to fiery debates right at the heart of our church. But it is my firm belief that we are called to embark on this painful road towards understanding, healing, and repair. I know we have much more to learn and much more to uncover from our historical research. We need events like this in order to listen carefully. It is our duty under God to confront the past and to walk with those who suffer the pain caused by enslavement, not being cowed by detractors, but seeking a better future for all in the light of Christ. Enslavement, of course, still exists on a huge scale globally. It is a cousin from the same family of inequalities of financial power, technological and scientific and military power, and lurks constantly seeking fresh ways to emerge. It was and is the greatest of evils in its denial of humanity, which is the root origin of enslavement and especially of transatlantic chattel slavery. For the Church of England to have been involved institutionally is a cause of infinite shame to me personally. I would deeply wish to have belonged to a church that had not done such things. It should prompt sorrow and require effective apology. And I am personally ashamed and deeply sorry for the terrible evil of the church's involvement. But apology is meaningless without proper action. For a church, that action must relate to transparency about history, and the debate in England remains very vigorous, with many people who challenge whether or to what degree the church profited. One of the most extraordinary comments that I've heard made to me is, but we didn't make much money out of it. On that basis, were I to attempt to murder someone but fail, I would have no guilt at all, because I missed. Apology and repentance for sin must be simultaneously vertically towards God and horizontally towards human beings. The prophets and the New Testament teach us that apology and so-called repentance that is not accompanied by action, that is not simultaneously vertical and horizontal, have no value in the sight of God. And so God says in Isaiah, I hate your feasts, because they are not accompanied by genuine changes of heart. There has to be a clear theology that recognizes what was done was sinful. And though it was done in the past, that sin can be corporate and its effects transgenerational, with responsibility for the delivery of the reparative justice falling on the descendants of the enslavers. It is a basic principle of reconciliation that it is not for the victims to argue for the oppressor to take action. It is for the oppressor convicted of their sin to change things. That is a basic principle. And the work on these issues of theology and history has, although extensive in places like the West Indies, West Africa, and the Global South, has not yet adequately penetrated into the thinking of Global North theology and historiography. It has not yet become an accepted reality, hence the pushback in England to the Church Commissioner's report. 30 years or so ago, I wrote a short booklet entitled Can Companies Sin? Looking back at my time in the oil industry, asking about corporate responsibility. Can we talk of corporate sin by a company, an institution, or a church? I argued that we could. It is a question that matters hugely. There is not time to develop it here, but it must be developed, for the misuse of that concept has had a terrible history in two ways. On the one hand, in the conflation of race with morality, rectitude, and holiness, resulting in the use of religious virtue to dehumanize others, the twisting and demonization of faith. That was and is still seen in the way that the concept of race and color is misused to this day. People of color, particularly from Africa, were and are made to suffer the twin indignities of subjugation and abuse. And they are then declared deserving of the abuse, a double abuse, as their race is evidence of moral corruption. And since this corruption is painted as innate, All past and future generations are deserving of any evil that falls upon them. It was seen in the churches simultaneously, this intergenerational guilt concept was abused in the European churches, and I'm carefully saying European because it is not seen nearly as much elsewhere. Persecution of the Jews, which was based in poisonous and evil concepts of corporate and ancestral guilt. Jews in the Middle East ages and later were killed all over the world because of the church-inspired theological idiocy that their ancestors killed Jesus. The deep sin of this libel was only in the late 20th century officially reversed. It is the same species of libel in a slightly different form that dehumanizes the people who suffered transatlantic slavery. If they were better people, it wouldn't have happened to them. Human evil uses race to its own unspeakable ends of power and hegemony in the past, in the present, and I fear deeply in the future. A common but equally insidious alternative to the ideas of generational corruption, ancestral guilt is found in philosophical individualism and the turn to the self, post-Descartes. This not only plays a role in the ultra-autonomy of the modern European concept of self, where I am not personally responsible for very much at all, certainly not for the sins of others, questionably my own, and it treats history as a closed file. If it is historic, it may be interesting, but we have no responsibility for it, goes that story. And we have a dreadful parallel facing us today, posed by climate change. We are led inexorably today to the conclusion that climate change is the existential threat to many small island nations, threatening livelihoods and life itself. We felt that here 2 weeks ago with Hurricane Beryl. While the sins against God's creation are very different from the abysmal horrors of chattel slavery, the same exploitive mindsets and ideologies that led to the trade in people has also led to an environmental crisis that is not coincidentally disproportionately affecting the world's poorest, as did chattel slavery, and as it does. The difference is that while in speaking of enslavement, so often the sins of the past are denied, even though they have great consequences in the present, on climate change, the sins of the present are tolerated despite the vast impact they will have on the future. The case for transgenerational ethics must be made convincingly from those who benefited most from chattel enslavement and from the nations that have benefited most from polluting energy sources. The sea that was the means of transport and used to facilitate the barbaric crossings, where lives were lost in their millions, where pain was ignored, where voices unheard, surrounds Jamaica. But God knows each one of those by name and hears their cries for justice. It is for all these reasons that the church commissioners have sought to learn more about the past through their research into the Queen Anne Bounty Fund, captured in part, as we will see, by Christoph's presentation. Crucially, it must not be people like me who make the decisions about where funds are directed and how. Decision-making must be informed by descendants and by those impacted by the legacy of enslavement, ensuring the centrality of representation by those who were most effective. And that brings me to the church in Jamaica today, noticing the time. My presentation is focused in the title on the way forward. Yeah, and it picks up the Diocese 200th anniversary celebration tag, yesterday, today, tomorrow, celebrating service, guarding justice, affirming hope. Yesterday, I spent the afternoon with students and lecturers at Church Teachers College in Mandeville. And there I met the next generation of inspirational and motivational teaching leaders. I found there the church that operates 12 secondary schools, 101 primary schools, and 9 preparatory schools, that has pioneered secondary education for girls and many other areas, living out and embodying its marks for mission. That is a sign of turning from the past, to teach those who were not considered worthy of the gospel as those who in the future will be global leaders in their field. The church also plays a seminal role in social welfare and healthcare, showing its presence is felt throughout public life. It has responded in every way it can to Hurricane Beryl. This is love in action. It operates children's homes for at-risk and underprivileged youngsters. And yesterday, as the parent of a child with learning difficulties, and indeed the grandparent, I was overwhelmed and deeply emotionally moved by hearing the work that is being done at that center on analyzing the needs of people with learning difficulties and seeing how attitudes to them can be changed. I give thanks for the nimble and productive way that the Diocese of Jamaica and the Cayman Islands lives out its marks of mission, inspired by and full of the Holy Spirit. How different from the Church of England in the 19th century, where in 1833, every single bishop in the House of Lords voted against emancipation. And for those reasons, I want to end, as Archbishop should at some point, with talking for about 8 lines about God. I'm sorry if you ask an Archbishop to speak, God will turn up at some point, even if only to make the microphones not work any longer so he shuts up. In the church, the center of our faith is that we depend on a God who is utterly faithful, who believes and who creates in and creates justice and righteousness and mercy. And therefore, we as a church, when we commit to challenging violence, injustice, oppression, the misuse of money, and when we put money second to working for peace and reconciliation and the proclamation of the good news of eternal salvation through Jesus Christ, when we put human resources aside, and this is not the only area in which they have dominated in the Church of England, I fear to say, but when we trust not in human aid, but in God alone, and act accordingly, we see deep sin transformed into healing and justice. But the cost of that is the wonderful risk and adventure of following Christ first, last, and always, and never letting power, money, influence, prestige, or history redirect us. That is a fight in the church in England and for the church in England. And I fear we are still deeply in the struggle. And I do not yet know whether in England we will have victory. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Archbishop. And I mean, one of the things that really struck me listening to you as well is that very thoughtful linking of the pain of chattel slavery to the climate change crisis that we here in the small island developing states are now facing. And, you know, we're here, we're coming to you with this webinar from the regional headquarters of the University of the West Indies. And it's such a fitting venue, given that as students, and yes, I'm a proud Pelican as well, as students, we all walked in the shadows of the aqueduct and other artifacts of slavery. And I often thought how ironic it was that, or maybe not ironic, maybe fitting, maybe wonderful it was that we, the sons and daughters of enslavement, are using this location, this historic site, to advance in ways that our former those who oppressed us could never have envisaged. It's also, I think, really fitting that some of the most eminent scholars in history, in reparatory justice, come from right here at the University of the West Indies. And at this point, I'd love to invite Professor Patrick Bryan to speak to us. He is an emeritus professor of history at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. He's a renowned scholar and author on social history in the Caribbean and Latin America. Professor Bryan.
My contribution is actually about the evolution of the church, of the Anglican Church, Church of the Province of the West Indies, since 1660. The Anglican Church succeeded the Roman Catholic Church as the established Church of Jamaica in the early 1660s during the reign of Charles II. The building of churches began almost immediately, and those two, the Vere Parish Church, the St. Andrew Parish Church, these were built by 1681. I actually like St. Dorothy, 1681, which is somewhere around the Old Harbor region. But the church was involved with more than churches. The Anglican clergy was deeply involved in the administration of the colony as members of the vestries or municipalities. In fact, the rector of the church was ex officio a member of the municipality. It is quite clear that the rubbing of shoulders between clergy and planters influenced the orientation of some priests. Not all priests were slave owners, but many were. So the role of the church became bound up with the system of slavery itself. And this, I think, of course, is the reason, justifiably, for looking at reparations. So the main criticism of the Anglican Church is that it supported slavery in Jamaica. We sometimes forget that the Moravians who came in 1754 also had a few slaves themselves. But I think what is really important is that initially the British government or the imperial government showed very little interest in regulating the moral or religious condition of slaves, leaving the House of Assembly, which consisted almost entirely of slave owners, to do exactly what they wished with respect to the imposition of laws and slave codes. What happened, however, it's almost accidental. The development, the growth of anti-slavery groups within Great Britain itself. And I should point out that these these anti-slavery groups were sometimes themselves Anglican. Wilberforce, Thomas Buxton, and all those guys that you've heard about. These were Anglicans with a sort of evangelical background. And the imperial government actually became more and more concerned about the situation of slaves and began to sponsor a program of amelioration, which would have meant easier manumission for the slaves, protection from abuse, and so on and so forth. There's even by 1820 a suggestion that children born of slaves be freed. I mean, those are the suggestions being made. But the Jamaican House of Assembly said absolutely not. And what we have is a conflict between the Jamaican House of Assembly, a very cantankerous body, with the British government, leading in fact to the suspension of the Jamaican Constitution in 1839. And interestingly enough, the suspension of the Constitution led to the fall of the Melbourne government in England. Okay. But what overriding the whole issue was the penetration of the Baptists and Methodists in the education of slaves in Jamaica. They came here in about 1780. And by 1807, the slave trade had been abolished. That was intended to be ameliorative. And the only positive thing we have from the 1790s is the mass baptisms of slaves, from which clergymen profited because there was a payment for each slave baptized. The conclusion that the British government reached was that the Anglican Church should become more involved by sending resident bishops to the Caribbean. For Jamaica, Dr. Christopher Lipscomb, 1824 until his death in 1843, and Barbados, William Hart Coleridge, who was ordained at about the same time as Lipscomb. So Lipscomb had a hectic time. First of all, there are planters who absolutely resisted the religious instruction of slaves. They resisted it. On the other hand, there were planters who are okay with it, right? So there's a rift here. More successful he was in the religious instruction in urban areas, particularly Kingston and Spanish Town. But his immediate role was to restructure the diocese, establishing 3 deaneries run by senior clergymen, and working with the Jamaican Assembly to bring about the Clergy Act of 1825. The bishop's powers were considerable, but the Assembly continued to cover the salaries of all clergy, except the bishop, of course, who was paid from London. But he insisted on a discipline within the church. All duties, baptism, marriage, burials, were to be formally recorded. So Lipscomb became convinced that there's a shortage of churches in Jamaica. I think his idea was that the planter class needs to become godlier. And in fact, he was criticized for this approach. So Lipscomb became a major builder of churches, not only using the church's resources, but the planter corporation who gave gifts of land and money and things, but public subscription as well. So at the end of his regime in 1843, he had consecrated 31 churches in those 19 years that he served as Bishop of Jamaica. Of course, he also pushed for the establishment of Sunday schools and also smaller schools attached to the various churches. That is my church at Snowdon, which Lipscomb consecrated in 1826. I think this is St. Saviour, one of the 13 churches constructed during his time. And then this is St. George's, East Street, which was built as a chapel of ease for the overcrowded Kingston Parish Church. But Lipscomb was also an educator. He established at least 50 national schools starting in 1826. Accepted non-Anglicans into these schools. And I must indicate too that he was actually busy in Cayman and Belize. In fact, he sent Reverend Sharp to Cayman to establish the diocese there, because there are no priests of any denomination in Cayman in 1825-26. Burials and weddings were conducted by specially licensed magistrates. Unfortunately, 2 of the churches built in Cayman were destroyed by hurricane by about the middle of the 19th century. But the next big change for the church came in between 1866 and 1879, the disestablishment. The disestablishment is a process whereby the subventions granted to the church by the assembly and by the imperial government were wiped out as of December 31, 1869. The Clergy Act, which had been responsible for the ideas behind the running of the church, the Clergy Acts were actually disassembled completely. Parish churches were reduced from 22 to 14, and the vacancies were not to be filled. That just tells you with Jamaica, with its 22 parishes in Jamaica, with its 14 parishes. Of course, Bishop Courtney regarded the action of the Crown, because it is the Crown who had agreed on this establishment, as an insult to Christ. But there's not much he could do, because Jamaica had simultaneously received the Crown Colony government, which gave the governor, Sir John Peter Grant, direct powers to do whatever he liked in a single chamber assembly. And I think there's a gleaner that reported that the Anglican Church was one of the most despised institutions in Jamaica. The Baptists shouted hurrahs for this establishment on the grounds that it gave religious freedom, and that a church attached to the state is a contradiction, all right? That churches should be built on a voluntary principle. Now, the Anglicans now had to go to the voluntary principle. So they held the first Anglican synods in January 1870 and September 1870. Even then, the governor did not relent. He demanded that they call a second synod, because the first one had not been democratically elected. Of course, in spite of Bishop Courtney's claim that he himself was an authoritarian, it didn't matter. So the church was formally disestablished by Law 30 of June 1870. The church, without predictable funding, resorted to fundraising in England, among the churches in England and among the planters who resided in England, as well as from local members of the elite. But the congregations actually gradually came into being in exchange, in some cases, for threepence per Sunday. Especially under Nuttall, who was bishop between 1880 and 1916, the principle of congregationalism and centralism was established. And the contemporary structures of the church come during this period, the Diocese and Financial Board and things like that. But more important is the beginning of indigenization of the clergy, because between frankly, about 1870 to 1879, we now see the beginning of the employment of Black and colored clergymen. Not many yet, but that was the gain speed during the 19th century. Now, this Archbishop Nuttall, he became Archbishop in 1897. Referred to in Jamaica at the time as the Moses of the Anglican Church. He came to Jamaica as a Methodist lay preacher, but joined the Anglican Church in, I think it was 1864. And his has been the longest regime, bishopric regime. And that's one of the first things he did, I think in 1883, was to establish a divinity school, which of course became St. Peter's College eventually. That is before the earthquake of 1907. And I must mention here the tremendous role of Archbishop Nuttall in raising funds for the reconstruction of the city of Kingston, so that people who used to criticize Nuttall now refer to him as our beloved Archbishop. And when he died in 1916, the Gleaner, the big headlines, "Our Father is dead." That's the sort of impact that he had. But the impact is also there in the establishment of nursing institutions, the expansion in number of priests and churches, the deaconess movement. The deaconesses were partly responsible for missions to girls in particular. Some of them, the Mildmay sisters, were trained in midwifery. They actually founded something like 9 high school type churches, but not all of them survived. Now, we can also comment on the Nuttall period as one in which there's a growing reverence for empire, and he himself was really an admirer of empire. But in social terms, the church acted like as a voluntary organization, depending very much upon raising funds. The high morale, which came about in the 1870s, actually seems to have continued. There was a Kingston Charity Organization Society, which Nuttall founded, and that was intended to ease the pressures on people in Kingston, because people have been migrating from the rural to the urban area. He was also concerned about housing, thinking that the building societies, like the Westmoreland Building Society, did not do enough for the poor. But with him, there is a development of an ecumenical thing, a movement of cooperation between the Anglican Church and the other churches in the island. Women were not allowed to vote at synod, not until 1916. Nuttall found this contradictory. He said, how can you refuse the woman the vote, and you're ruled by a queen. Anyway, that was settled eventually. And there are some, his views were sometimes criticized because they were outside the mainstream. Like the Black Jamaican working classes did not really differ fundamentally from the British working classes. If you wanted to listen to Bedward as an Anglican, you're free to do so. The Catholics had said, no, 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 you don't go to the Augustown stream to listen to Bedward. But he said, no, you go and listen. And then in Jamaica, we have had what you call revivalist movements. There's one in 1860, 1861, there's one in 1883, then there's Bedward in the 1890s. But that's also revivalism as, quote, vital religion, end of quote. I think it is his Methodism that actually determined that approach. So the church, as Dr. Hall left it, really became the foundation for the modern church. There's no doubt about the indigenization of clergy during this period. He was succeeded by Bishop de Carteret, who was acting bishop from about 1913. So his vast continuity, he was very famous for temperance, although decided women should vote at Synod for the first time, and also protested against the failure of the government to look into better wages for Jamaican workers who were the cream, those who migrated were the cream of the Jamaican workforce. That was his position. He also established the Diocesan Festival Choir. Now, bishops continued to be imported. Even though the clergy was being Jamaicanized. Until 1947, Bishop Gibson became suffragan bishop of Kingston, the first Jamaican of African descent to touch the bishop's chair. Famous for his headmastership of Kingston College, of which he was founding headmaster. And his position was that religious instruction was very important for the boys at Kingston College, because he insisted Christian values in Jamaica were being trampled underfoot. But his monumental achievements arise from the resurgence of the construction of schools. Bishop Gibson High School, Queens High School, Glenmere High School, all these came into being. And then the tertiary institution, the Church Teachers College in Mandeville. That's the Church Teachers College. I can't put in all the bishops, unfortunately, but I mentioned this one was particularly outspoken, and his synod charges, which have been published and edited by the present Archbishop, have the book, the Journey to the Promised Land, has a lot of critiques of the future of the Anglican Church and Jamaican society. Then there's Bishop Alfred Reed, who succeeded in 2001. I think he's mostly known for his contribution to the new hymn book and a deep concern with the architectural heritage of Jamaica. And then we come to Most Reverend Howard Gregory, 2012, incumbent bishop, Archbishop of the Church in the province of the West Indies since 2019. The United Theological College, which we show there, is an indication of the growth of the ecumenical movement. What maybe one of the most significant changes has been the ordination of women in Jamaica. I got 3, which was strongly supported by the Jamaican church. There were 1 or 2 people who said, no, we're not so sure. But generally, and I think Reverend Johnson is the rector of Good Shepherd's Church, I think. Yes, which she built, right? So the Anglican Church then, as His Grace pointed out, has several high schools. And by the way, they are among the best high schools in the island. And they are preparatory schools. I'll get to redemption song later. Oh, it's finished. Okay, sorry. No, something went wrong. Something went wrong there. Okay. Yes, the church has continued its tradition of education at maybe 12 high schools, at least 8 prep schools, and scores of primary schools, most of which were now leased to the government of Jamaica. There are children's homes, old people's homes, primary and secondary schools, and of course, the degree-granting Church Teachers College. The present Archbishop, like the former Bishop, De Souza, continues in the and Bishop Gibson, continues in the same vein as to critique society. But he says the basis of his discussion is the scriptures, traditions, and reason. And I don't think I'm misquoting him. He also insists that the church is not here to condemn, but to engage. He supports Republican status for Jamaica. And it's sort of, some people describe this as liberal, but I'm afraid to use the word liberal, which has been associated with not being nice. Then, finally, we are aware of changes in the society and differences of opinion within the church itself. We have the problem of sexuality, homosexual marriage, the question of reparations, which we have been going into. How does the church respond to this? How do we answer those people who think that the Anglican Church does not actually reflect the culture of Jamaica and Jamaicans? And so these are questions which I think we will have to answer at some point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Brian. And, I heard, a little spattering of applause. People are in the room with us, and I can't clap, So first things first, I need to make a correction. My mother messaged me and said, Diana, I was a lay reader, not a deacon. So had to make that correction. We have a saying in Jamaica, so when you say people don't talk with water in their mouth, meaning they are clear, they're outspoken, they're not afraid to speak truth to power. And our next speaker, Professor Vereen Shepherd, absolutely don't talk with water in her mouth. She's a wonderfully outspoken advocate for reparations and social justice, not just in Jamaica, the Caribbean, but on the international scene. She's Professor Emerita of History and Gender Studies at the University of the West Indies, Mono. She's also Vice Chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, Director of the Center for Reparations Research here at the UWI Mono, and the former Chair of the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Prof.
Thank you very much, Moderator Dion. Greetings, everyone. Unlike you, Dion, I am not an Anglican. I'm actually non-aligned. But I thank Cecile for inviting me to be a part of this very necessary conversation this morning. I recognize the presence of the Most Reverend and Right Honorable Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, the Most Reverend Dr. the Honorable Howard K.A. Gregory, OJ, Archbishop of the West Indies, Primate and Metropolitan, and Bishop of Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. I want to greet other officers of the church or the churches. I don't know if only Anglican officers are here. I want to greet my fellow panelists, the organizers, the technical staff, including from the UWI, and my assistant, Mia McMorris, is around there from the Center for Reparation Research, and friends all in the room and watching and listening online. As you can see from the PowerPoint, I have titled my presentation From Sinners to Saints, the Legacies of Chattel Enslavement in Churches and Educational Institutions in Jamaica. And that I'm talking about that because Cecile told me to talk about legacies. But before going any further, I want to acknowledge my great-great-grandfather, Alexander Mighty, born into slavery in the parish of St. Catherine in 1829. And I also want to recognize and honor the Tikar people of Cameroon who were forcefully taken to Jamaica and to whom I'm connected on my mother's side. I invite their spirits to occupy the spaces around me as I join with like-minded advocates on this webinar to seek for the appeasement of their torture. Now, the story of conquest, usurpation, manipulation, and illegitimate appropriation of Caribbean resources by colonial powers is a familiar one. As various historians have reminded us, colonization entailed the adjustment on ancestral lands of erected structures of domination and control. As an important stage in the global process of westernization, it meant the imposition of racism, the principal assumption of difference, and the elevation to iconic status of discoverers, monarchs, and military people. The most egregious aspect of colonialism was the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans, which resulted in approximately 5.5 million Africans being forced into chattel enslavement in the British colonized Caribbean from the 17th to the 19th centuries. Approximately 1.5 million in Jamaica alone. At emancipation, 311,692 were left. I should have said only. Leading several scholars, including Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, one of our top historians and our Vice Chancellor here at the University of the West Indies, to speak in terms of the genocidal impact of chattel enslavement. Along the horrific nature of the trafficking over 300 years and over 20,000 voyages, voyages sound like it's not appropriate, it sound like a tourist ship or something, like a cruise, which it was not. But anyway, alongside the horrific nature of the trafficking was the rapidity of its development. And I really want you to look at this illustrative map that I think, Mia, that's, yes, here, there we go. I want to pause a little to look at this illustrative map done by Andrew Khan and Jamil Bui from the David Eltis database. And I'm going to pause so that you can see the development. So it's starting slowly. You're not going to see many dots flying across from Africa to the Americas. But I want you to see how by the 17th century, the trafficking has intensified. And I'm going to just pause a little here. It's very important that this is understood, because we can't talk about legacies before talking about what left those legacies on our landscape. So as you continue to watch, let me continue. Enslaved Africans were subjected to the worst atrocities imaginable. kidnapping, storage in filthy barracoons, the Middle Passage, forced drowning, as in the case of the slaver Zong, branding with hot iron, including by the church, with SPG being seared into the flesh of those they owned, unrelenting field and factory labor, legal codes that rendered them non-human, and harsh punishments when they resisted enslavement, deportation, dismemberment, hanging, imprisonment, severe flogging, including of women and the children. According to Lucille Mathurin Mayer, and I quote, "Neither age nor pregnancy exempted women from corporal punishment. Rather, they were laid down in the filthiest place the driver could find for floggings. Child labor was rampant, and women and girls faced sexual violence." Orlando Patterson wrote in his Sociology of Slavery the following: "The sexual exploitation of female slaves by white men was the most disgraceful aspect of Jamaican slave society." Unfortunately, the church was complicit in this crime against humanity. Initially, Christian planters did not think that the African was of theological significance. According to Elsa Gavaya, and I quote, "Early English slave law almost totally neglected the enslaved as a subject for religious instruction, as a member of a family, or as a member of society possessing some rights, as the same rights as everyone else." Mary Prince, who experienced enslavement in several locations, including the UK and Bermuda, before gaining her freedom there in England, had this to say. She put it like this: "Since I have been here in England, I have often wondered how English people can go out into the West Indies and act in such a beastly manner. But when they go to the West Indies, they forget God and all feelings of shame, I think, since they can do such things." Despite this, at emancipation, enslavers, including some 96 Anglican priests, received compensation, as you can see. Today, 186 years after full free, on 1st August 1838, the legacies of chattel enslavement are still with us. Landlessness by too many, structural discrimination in education, poor social infrastructure, the evidence of which hurricanes lay bare, environmental degradation, because there was deforestation to establish plantations, so it's coming from there, and vulnerability to climate change and natural disasters. People are speaking now about the Capitalocene. Another legacy was a yearning for a homeland and an ethnic identity as African or descendants of African, not as colored or mixed race or any such designation. And Peter Tosh was right. No matter where you come from, you're an African. And as long as you're Black, you're an African. Other legacies: racial profiling of young Black men and their overrepresentation in the prisons that date back to colonial times. Hanging is still on the books. Obia is still illegal. And while we love African dances and food, other aspects of African culture fare differently or are seen as show or performance. The nation language with African inputs is not accepted widely. Anti-Black racism, racial profiling, low self-esteem by Black-skinned children because of the persistent pigmentocracy and prejudice against hair texture are still present. But let's hope that the recent ruling by Jamaica's appeal court that Kensington Primary School's 2018 ban on dreadlocks breaches the constitutional rights of the child will end the discrimination against African-inspired hairstyles and textures in Jamaica. Women are subjected to the Victorian gender order and their dress patrolled by the dress police. For the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, though, the worst legacies are poverty, underdevelopment, marginalization, social exclusion, economic disparities, instability, and insecurity that affect many people in different parts of the world, in particular in developing countries. The CARICOM Reparations Commission's 10-point plan that serves as a blueprint for the reparation movement outlines other legacies, the challenges faced by indigenous peoples who were subjected to native genocide and the disconnection with Africa, leading to the call for African reconnection and repatriation, as well as for the return of our cultural heritage from places that stole them. We said thief in the local language. The CRC points out the high incidence of type 2 diabetes and hypertension because of the diet under chattel enslavement, and which still persists. Medics tell us that there is intergenerational transmission of some lifestyle diseases, as well as the intergenerational transmission of trauma. The underdevelopment of the region because of the extraction of wealth under colonialism and the failure of the British to ensure compensation at independence have had lasting impacts, which is why the recent quantification of the harm of transatlantic chattel slavery by the Brattle Group, directed by our own Patrick Robinson, who is here, is important. But there's another legacy that we see mostly in the Anglican cathedrals and chapels, as well as in some of our educational institutions. The treatment like saints of those who sinned against our African people. Yes, traffickers and enslavers have been given almost saint-like status on our landscape, in our churches and in some of our schools. My consciousness about this was first raised when I visited the Spanish Town Cathedral, or I don't know what you call it today, if it's the St. Catherine Anglican Cathedral, and saw that the memory of many enslavers and members of their family has been preserved. I have since seen other sinners being elevated to the status of saints in churches, chapels, schools, and universities in Jamaica and the UK, when they really belong in a museum, not in full view of students and worshippers. I will go through a few of these slides quickly, just a sample to show you what my assistant, O'Shane Robinson, found when I asked him to go into some of these cathedrals. So at the St. Catherine Cathedral, you'll find a memorial to Andrew Archdeacon, Attorney General of Jamaica in 1734, and owner of hundreds of enslaved people on Golden Grove Plantation in St. Thomas in the East, as it was then, now St. Thomas, and also a monument to enslaver Dr. Francis Rigby Broadbelt. The next slide shows the Kingston Parish Church. In the Kingston Parish Church, we find Henry Roden, who owned the Frankfield Coral River Estate in Clarendon. Edward Manning, enslaver and agent of the South Sea Company, is also in the Kingston Parish Church. He owned 2 plantations. In the St. Andrew Parish Church, we find Vice Admiral Thomas Davers, 1689 to 1746, and Royal Navy officer who served as Commander-in-Chief of the Jamaica Station, and he had a share in a plantation in Barbados. We also have in the St. Andrew Parish Church, Reverend Thomas Stewart. He received compensation for 100 enslaved people on Glebe Pen. Then, of course, we all know of Hamilton Brown. He's in the cemetery of the Brownstown Anglican Church. In 1834, he enslaved a total of 983 African people on several plantations. And Brownstown, of course, is named after him still. And if you study the 1831-32 Emancipation War in Jamaica, Final Emancipation War, to say no to chattel enslavement, you may come across the information about how he came out of his house with his weapons, say, come in here if you're bad, kind of thing. And then we have enslaver James Galloway in the Trelawney Parish Church. He had interest in Unity Hall and Amity Hall plantations. And that reprobate Thomas Thistlewood, who raped so many enslaved women and tortured men in the various places that he either owned or on which he worked, is buried in the church cemetery of the Savannah Anglican Church. Now, I went there to ask to see the grave. They told me that the expansion of the church is over it, so I couldn't do anything. My final sample in Jamaica is enslaver William Carr Walker, who was in the Hanover Parish Church. During the Emancipation War of 1831-32, William Carr Walker fought against the enslaved people who were trying to gain their freedom. The monument within the parish church pays homage to the defense of his property during the war. I do not know what the local leaders of the Anglican churches can do about symbolic decolonization. Will their answer be, let bygones be bygones? Let the dead, even the most vile ones, rest in peace? Will it be, we need reconciliation now? Yes, we do. But something has to come before that. I will wait and see. And even in the UK, we see these enslavers and traffickers being venerated. One example is that of William Beckford. In 1737, he inherited over a dozen plantations and 3,000 enslaved Africans in Jamaica. According to Robert Beckford, in an article in the UK Guardian of September 2023, and I quote, "Keeping a statue to William Beckford on display reeks of moral failure," and he's a churchman himself. "It belongs in a museum alongside clear details of his crimes against humanity." Another example that came to light recently is that of Tobias Rostat, whose image is high up on the inside front wall near the altar of the Chapel of Jesus College, University of Cambridge. Tobias Rostat, 1608 to 1694, was one of Jesus College's most significant donors, but he also had financial and other involvement in the Company of Royal African Adventurers trading to Africa and the Royal African Company. His involvement in these companies lasted from 1662 to his death in 1694, including at the time of his donation to the college in 1671. He invested at least £760, the equivalent of, well, some people say it's the equivalent of £112,900 today, in the Royal African Company, and what would be £60,000 today in the Royal African Company. And so, of course, some people are saying, well, it wasn't that much. Well, a matter of perspective. Jesus College, conscious of the discomfort of students, especially those of African descent, who worship or have to attend college events in the chapel, appealed to the Church of England to allow them to remove Rostat. Instead, they were taken to ecclesiastical court. They lost the case and had to pay damages. I know that the Archbishop of Canterbury, and thank you, Archbishop, supported Jesus College in their bid to take him down. But right now, he is still in the chapel and over the landscape of Cambridge. And I must say, I was asked by the master, who is really a woman, a Black woman of Jesus College, to give evidence at the hearing, but the powers that be said they didn't want me to come. They don't want to hear anything from me. They don't see what slavery has to do with it. Huh? Several of our schools are also hugging up enslavers. Of course, with new information and increased awareness, some educational institutions in Jamaica have taken steps to honor those whose labor allowed enslavers to transform themselves from sinners to saints and leave donations to educate the descendants of those they brutalized. I know that the University of the West Indies, and you mentioned this, Dion, but perhaps if you walk on the campus now, you will see monuments to the enslaved who walked here before us. And I see Professor Satchel there. Some of us were in that movement to reshape the landscape and ensure that we engage in symbolic decolonization. Since so many of us here are talking about this publicly, we need to put our mouth, we need to do the work right here. Also, Mannings High has plans. JC and Hampton have taken steps, or others are planning to take steps to honor those who laid the tiles on which we walk today. And I will keep pressing the others. And you see that there's a plaque. I was really happy. It wasn't all I wanted. I asked for a monument. I sent all the names of the donors, enslaved Africans there, but it's a start, and there's a plaque now to honor them. We have to acknowledge, though, as Christopher C. Fennell remarked in his African Diaspora Heritage in the Americas, and indeed many cultural historians, that despite the negative legacies, African people have transformed and created new cultural configurations in all new locations across the Atlantic. African descendant populations built the infrastructure of colonial economies and reshaped landscapes. He continues, and I quote, "Overcoming the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, captive Africans further developed myriad forms of cultural knowledge and practices drawn from their homeland cultures and conveyed those aspects of heritage to their descendants and social affiliates. Special knowledge of agricultural industries, and we could add metallurgy as we know, led to transform landscapes. Resilience and fights for freedom were represented in self-emancipation, rebellious communities, reverence of burial grounds, and commemorations of lost settlements and ancestors across terrains and seascapes. Elements of cosmologies from multiple African cultures were integrated to form new religions and forms of cultural heritage. Over the past 6 centuries, African diaspora peoples have pursued vitality in their cultural heritage and continue to fight for reparative justice to address European colonial wrongs," end of quote. So to conclude, indeed, since the period of modernity, as several scholars have demonstrated, Caribbean people have sought to eradicate and dismantle political structures of imperialism, historical representations of the Caribbean in text and image that mostly reflected British colonial subjectivity and authority. Remove the iconic stamp of the colonizers, in the process reclaiming and restructuring the indigenous African, Creole, and later Asian experience. The Caribbean has made great strides on the decolonization path. Colonialism as a form of European world rule has mostly completed its cycle. Yes, but what we could call the 5th phase, that of mental liberation and iconic decolonization, is still in action, despite the age-old pleas of Marcus Garvey and Bob Marley. I suggest that part of this project requires a process of redressing the legacies of chattel enslavement and engaging in more meaningful reparatory justice conversations. The church needs to intensify its role in the project of symbolic decolonization, if for no other reason but to honor the memory of our African ancestors who were brutalized by members of the Anglican and other churches. Apologies and the commitment of small sums are important steps, but we want more concrete action and justice for those who died in the cause of Caribbean freedom. For example, those you're seeing here who fought for freedom in Barbados in the 1816 war and in Jamaica in the final Emancipation War. And when we call for the removal of statues and monuments that fly in the face of the pain, it is not a distraction. The CRC reinforces why the advocacy for justice will continue. It is because European states, individuals, and institutions were owners and traders of enslaved Africans, instructed genocidal actions upon indigenous communities, created the legal, financial, and fiscal policies necessary for the enslavement of Africans, defined and enforced African enslavement and native genocide as in their national interest, refused compensation to the enslaved with the ending of their enslavement, and even the post-slavery and post-independence periods when the harm continues. Reparation advocates call upon the European governments to address the CARICOM Reparatory Justice Program to restore the dignity of the victims and their descendants, and we call upon more Christians and more churches to be our allies. We, the victims, must be the ones who set the demand, and we welcome all hands on deck. Thank you so much.
Can't say I didn't warn you. Can't say I didn't warn you. No water in her mouth. So when you go to church tomorrow, walk with your notebook or your notes app. note down all those names and all those monuments that you've been walking past for years without paying any attention. Go look them up on the internet, see who they are, and then join the conversation about what, if anything, to do about those monuments. Thank you so much, Prof. So just to say, I did say I would be taking some questions in between, but a lot of the questions coming in are for the Archbishop. Warning you from now, Archbishop. So I've decided to reverse my ruling and hold all the questions to the end of the presentations. Now, our next speaker, Justice Patrick Robinson, recently retired from the International Court of Justice, popularly known as the World Court. He's also a former president of the International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia, and he's now turned his considerable expertise to the legal issues surrounding enslavement and reparations. So I have to tell you that when such an eminent jurist approached me this morning, I made an application for a few extra minutes because he said he's going to be speaking on two topics which are critical for us to put this whole conversation in context, accompanied by an affidavit of urgency, as well as an application for contempt proceedings to be stayed if he goes over time. You know, I have to ask the other jurists in the room to back me up when I say, as junior counsel, I could not refuse. So you have 3 extra minutes, Prof. Justice, I beg your pardon, after which the gavel will come down.
Well, let me begin by thanking the moderator. I seem to have benefited from her legal training. I have 2 topics to deal with, and to address that in 15 minutes, I have to move with Usain Bolt pace, and I don't have Usain Bolt pace. I begin by saying that I want to adopt the salutations given by Professor Shepherd. So my first topic is the question of the liability of the Church of England for its role in TCS in Barbados. As we commemorate the 200th year of the Diocese of Jamaica and the Cayman Islands, let us remember Barbados, whose Anglican diocese also turns 200 this year. We must not forget our island republic neighbor. After all, it was events in Barbados in the early 18th century that meant that both the Barbados diocese and the Jamaica and the Cayman Islands diocese did not come into being until a century later than was envisaged by the leading Church of England figures in Great Britain. During the 1710s, there was talk of a Jamaica diocese based in St. Kitts and a presidency, that is a bishop, at the Codrington estate in Barbados, which had recently been bequeathed by Christopher Codrington to the church's missionary arm, the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, the SPG. According to historian J. Bennett, the unholy trinity of Negro conversion, a seminary, and an episcopacy was bound to stir the prejudices of Barbadians. I think he meant white Barbadians. In the result, the diocese that we commemorate and the Barbados diocese would not come into being until more than a century later, 1824. In the view of the theologian Robert Beckford, Codrington is worth revisiting because of what he calls victim-centered reparative justice. During the SPG's ownership of the Codrington estate from 1712 to 1838, the Archbishop was the president of the SPG. The estate is now owned by the United Society Partners in the Gospel, the USPG, of which the Archbishop is also president. The SPG was the missionary arm of the Church of England, which I refer to as the Church in Barbados. Its successor, the USPG, published a statement on September 8, 2023, in which it acknowledged that the SPG, as an agent of the Church, purchased between 600 and 1,200 Africans to provide force-free labor on estates bequeathed by Christopher Codrington to the SPG. There is additional evidence that on the 17th November 1758, Archbishop Thomas Secker agreed to reimburse the SPG for the purchase of Africans to work on the Codrington estate. Ladies and gentlemen, the saddest part of this narrative concerning Archbishop Secker was his statement, and here I quote, "But we must take things as they are at present," signifying that for him, the excessively violent treatment of the enslaved, their consequential death, and the purchase of new supplies was a relentless and unyielding cycle that had to continue, even though he acknowledged that, in his words, it proceeds from some defect of humanity. On these basis, the church bears liability for its wrongful conduct that breached the normative general principle of humanity. For the purposes of reparations, I have settled on 900 as the number of Africans enslaved between 1712 and 1838. In its statement, the USPG indicated that it will invest in partnership with the Codrington Trust 7 million sterling or 18 million Barbados dollars over a period of 10 to 15 years as reparatory justice. I wish to make the following comments on this arrangement. 1, whereas reparations are required by law as a response to internationally wrongful conduct, reparatory justice is prompted by moral considerations. Ladies and gentlemen, reparatory justice is not reparations, and it should be clarified that the sum does not represent reparations, which is what some may think because of a resemblance in the wording of the two terms. Reparative justice, no doubt, has its own value, but it has no place in the law of reparations. A concern I have is that it may become a vehicle for avoiding reparations. 2, there is an irrationality about the sum to be invested in that it appears to be plucked from thin air. 3, the sum of 18 million Barbados dollars is inadequate as reparations for the enslavement of approximately 900 Africans over a period of 126 years. That's about 20,000 Barbados dollars or 10,000 US dollars per enslaved African. It is noted that the church has an amalgamated endowment fund which has financial assets in excess of 10 billion pounds. One of my collaborators, Coleman Basilon, of the Brattle Group of Evaluators, quantified the reparations due on the basis of the following heads of damages: loss of life and income, personal injury, loss of liberty, pain and suffering, and gender-based violence. The sum arrived at was about 7.7 billion US dollars, calculated at 2.5% interest, and I have attached that to my speech. I want to stress that it remains within the sovereign will of the Barbados government to determine that it will accept another lower sum as reparations. The quantum of reparations for the church's participation in TCS is to be determined by the government of Barbados in consultation with the Codrington Trust, the latter being the owner of the Codrington estate by virtue of the 1983 Codrington Trust Act. 5, since the church is assimilated to an organ of the state, the United Kingdom is also responsible for the payment of the compensation of about $7.7 billion to the government of Barbados on a state-to-state basis. The government of Barbados should attend to this matter, which is beyond the scope of the Codrington Trust. It is for the government, in consultation with the United Kingdom, to determine the quantum of reparations. Ladies and gentlemen, as I've said before, I do not support reparations in the form of an investment by the responsible state or institution when the sum used for the investment is the compensation that is to be paid to the victim state as reparations. If the responsible state or institution wishes to make an investment in the victim state, then it should use its own funds for that purpose, not the compensation that should be paid over to the victim state as reparations. It is for the victim state to determine how that compensation should be used in the interest of the descendants of the enslaved. 7, in the present arrangement, there is, in my view, an unacceptable confluence of interest between the USPG, an arm of the church, and the trust, which, with 5 of its members appointed by the church and 2 by the minister responsible for ecumenical affairs, is a church-dominated body. There is no representation in the trust of the interest of the descendants of the enslaved. In this odd arrangement, the trust, which has inherited the obligations of the very body that carried out the wrongful conduct of TCS, has become the sole adjudicator of the quantum of reparations. My solution: in light of the inadequacy of the reparations, the trust should pay additional compensation to the government following consultations between a government team, including representatives of the descendants of the enslaved and the trust. Alternatively, the 1983 Codrington Trust Act should be amended to provide for effective representation of the interests of the descendants of the enslaved by expanding membership of the trust to include members of the Barbados Reparations Committee or some other like-minded body. 8, when the sums earned by the trust from the practice of TCS are ascertained, they should be disgorged from the trust. Disgorged is a technical term. I don't mean to be offensive. Disgorged from the trust on the basis of unjust enrichment and passed over to the descendants of the Africans enslaved on the Codrington estate. The 3rd American Restatement of the Law defines unjust enrichment as any unequal transfer of value without an adequate legal basis. Turn now very quickly to the question of the legality of transatlantic chattel slavery. In discussing the question of the legality of transatlantic chattel slavery, TCS, the inquiry is not about the legality of slavery in general. Rather, and more relevantly, it is about the legality of TCS, the incidence of which differed significantly from other forms of servile labor, whether in Europe, Africa, Asia, or elsewhere. Failure to make this distinction conflates TCS with other forms of servile labor and undermines any conclusion that TCS was not unlawful at the time it was carried out. Europeans maintain that slavery existed in Africa at the time of TCS. Yes, it did. But the so-called slavery in Africa was equivalent to serfdom in Europe. So-called slaves in some countries enjoyed tremendous privileges that made it difficult to distinguish their position from that of persons who were free. And I've cited in my text books that you can refer to if you want to find out more about Africans' servile labor, which bore no relationship whatsoever to the incidence of TCS. Ladies and gentlemen, the difference between servile labor in Africa or US or Europe and TCS is that in general, the enslaved in TCS was treated as a thing, an item of property, and was wholly dehumanized. For example, but you've heard mention of him already, Thomas Thistlewood, and my God, I'm ashamed, he's from my parish. Thomas Thistlewood's punishment for a runaway slave from his Jamaican plantation must rank as the most evil punishment ever devised in the history of mankind. He forced another enslaved African to defecate in the mouth of the runaway, which was then gagged for 3 hours. It is this difference, which I argue is a difference of kind rather than degree, in the treatment of servile labor that made TCS an unlawful practice from its inception. And one need look no further than the 4,000 miles forced transportation across the Atlantic to discern the difference between TCS and other forms of servile labor. The difference, ladies and gentlemen, was the normative general principle of humanity, which called for respect of the inherent dignity and worth of the human person, whether in Europe, Africa, Asia, the Americas, the Caribbean, or elsewhere. Let me now mention some state practice. In the 1814 Treaty of Ghent between the UK and the USA, the parties, both slaveholding states, asserted that the traffic in slaves is irreconcilable with the principles of humanity and justice. 1 year later, Great Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal, all slaveholding states, plus Prussia, Russia, Sweden, and Austria, adopted the Vienna Declaration, in which they concluded that the slave trade has been considered by just and enlightened men of all ages as repugnant to the principles of humanity and universal morality. And notably for these states, these principles were not new. They certainly existed from the very inception of TCS in about 1450. And the declaration is therefore declaratory, not constitutive of the principles. The Indian author Bandyopadhyay wrote that in ancient India, the Indian slave had not only the protection of religion, but also the protection of the law, and that violation of a female was punished. In Africa, the Mandan Charter, proclaimed in 1213 by Sunjata, founder of the Mali Empire, recognized the basic human rights of all persons 2 years before the English Magna Carta. The Charter outlawed slave trading and declared that every human life is a life. One life is not superior to another. Every wrong done to life demands reparations. In my view, ladies and gentlemen, the principle of humanity is the forerunner to the most important development in international law since 1945. The growth of a corpus of law affirming fundamental human rights on the basis of respect for the inherent dignity and worth of the human person. And therefore, the traditional European position that slavery was not unlawful under the law of nations is deeply flawed. Not only because it conflates TCS with other forms of servile labor, but also because of its failure to recognize that there was a law of nations that included the practice of states other than those in Europe. That regional practice conflicted with the universal law of nations, which, on the basis of the normative general principle of humanity, called for respect of the inherent dignity and worth of all persons, whether Africans or Europeans. And thus, the more liberal approach to TCS that you see in the first part of the 19th century is not to be seen as a turning point in the law of nations, but as the beginning of the end of a 400-year-old European regional aberration. The chattelization of Africans into things, items of property, had the following phases: capture and sale in Africa, the trek to the dungeons and ships on the coast, the Middle Passage and the passage to Brazil, sale on the auction blocks in the Americas and the Caribbean, work on the plantations or elsewhere, and the concomitant trade in TCS. Every phase, ladies and gentlemen, was outlawed by the normative general principle of humanity. Since it is inappropriate for the USPG alone to take responsibility for the ills of the church, the Archbishop of Canterbury, as its leader, should use the opportunity presented by this commemoration to make a statement acknowledging that the church participated in the wrongful practice of TCS in Barbados. The church must ensure that through reparations, not reparatory justice, through reparations, justice is done to the descendants of the enslaved on the Codrington estate. Thank you.
So any of your questions coming in, so when we putting those questions to our panelists, I am also going to be just asking, just before I go into the first question, if Archbishop would like to say a word or two in response to the other speakers. Archbishop?
Excuse me.
I think that the one comment, just very briefly in answer, in response to the last challenge by the last speaker to make a statement acknowledging the Church's part in TCS, in the Church of England's part in TCS in Barbados, has been made not only by me, but by the General Synod of the Church of England on a number of occasions. And I re-emphasize that now. We were involved in slavery throughout the Caribbean and indirectly through investment in the South Sea Company and in the Royal West Africa Company, or in annuities that they issued in the transport of slaves across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage.
But here is the difference, Archbishop. I want you to acknowledge not just that you're involved in slavery per se, that you were involved in the wrongful practice of enslavement.
I don't consider there's a rightful practice of enslavement. Therefore, by definition, we were involved in the wrongful practice of enslavement.
And by wrongful, I mean unlawful, just to be clear.
I mean morally and ethically wrongful. I'm not a lawyer. I can't answer the question as to lawful. That's beyond my capacities, but it was certainly unethical and deeply morally wrong in an absolute sense, with no mitigation at all.
But the problem is that reparations depend on an unlawful act. And this is why from the very beginning, I've said that this term, which is flying around, of reparatory justice, we have to get rid of it and talk about reparations. What our ancestors deserve is reparations, because what they were involved was an unlawful practice that was imposed on them.
It's a really,
That is what brings the payment of compensation.
it's a really interesting distinction, but to give us a little bit more context, I just want to invite to talk to us a little bit as well, an online guest who we have with us, who is Christophe Adamek, who is the archivist, in fact, at the Lambeth Palace Library, which is the official library of the Church of England, and he's joining us online.
Good morning, everyone. I welcome everyone present, both online and at the university. Greetings to the co-speakers. I just wanted to say I feel very honored to have been invited to join you, and humbled by the co-speakers and the audience, and also the subjects. I'm not an expert in enslavement or the Church of England involvement in it, as well as not an expert in the reparatory justice. What I'm going to present is a presentation illustrating what we have in the archives in terms of records relating to the enslavement. And then my idea is to encourage further research. So if I share the screen with you and then start presenting. Just a few words about the library itself. So it is located in the, sorry, I have a problem with slides moving. It is located in the grounds of the Lambeth Palace. And then Apologies, my laptop is not very cooperating. So that's what the library is. It's a new building. We've moved all the collections in there in 2020. It's around 20 linear meters of shelving containing both archives and printed books. I'll just say a few words about what has been done so far. So Archbishop Justin mentioned, and other speakers as well mentioned the Church Commissioners research into the historic links to transatlantic slavery. That was commissioned in 2019. And then initial research was done by archive staff at the Lambeth Palace Library, followed by the research done by a forensic accountancy company called Grant Thornton. That was followed by the publication of a report in 2023, and then setting up of the fund that was also mentioned here. What the Grant Thornton did, they basically transcribed 8 volumes of the account of the Queen's Anne Bounty. That was basically a predecessor body to the current Church Commissioners. It was created in 1704, basically with a noble intention of augmenting lives of the poorer clergy, and initially it was funded by the so-called first fruits and annates, which were basically taxes paid by the clergy to the crown. But during that research, it was identified that also Queen's Anne Bounty gained income from investment in the South Sea Company, which was an enslaving company, transporting, as it was mentioned, in horrific conditions, capturing and transporting in horrific conditions enslaved Africans from Africa to the Caribbean and South America. It was estimated that around 30% of the Queen's Anne Bounty income was drawn from investments in the South Sea Company shares, and then another 14% from benefactions from individuals, which basically donated money to Queen's Anne Bounty. This is an example of a benefaction from Edward Colston, the infamous Edward Colston. All of those, as I say, ledgers and benefaction registers have been transcribed, put into Excel, and then uploaded into our online archives catalog. So this is all available for research for whoever would be interested. And they also have been digitized. So you can go on our website and then look up the digital version of those. So I would like to encourage anybody interested in that in further research. Just very briefly, I'd like to mention some more relevant collections contained within the library. 5 quite interesting and major collections. So these are the papers of Archbishop Thomas Secker, who was president of the Society for Propagation of Gospel. And then those 4 volumes of his papers directly relate to the Society of Propagation of Gospel, of the Gospel. And another missionary society, Christian Faith Society, which archives we have also at the library, and the archives of the Bishops of London, so-called Fulham Papers, and they contain quite a lot of volumes relating to the administration of the church in the Caribbean and in America. So it's a very important source of information for the early colonial history, including a lot of references to and then testimonies relating to the enslavement. I very quickly just mention a few. So this is receipts of payments on accounts of the Society for Propagation of the Gospel in their plantations, in famous plantations in Barbados, for the 7 years between 1737 and 1743. And then if you look at the right bottom section of that slide, you will see that they note that 69 Negroes were purchased within the 7 years for the amount of £1,933. And just as the Queen's Anne Bounty records, and then this particular record, I think what is really striking that, you know, records who used to be financial records have become an evidence of a horrific crime. And then this is also evidence of how the enslaved people were treated by the enslavers, so they wouldn't bother to denote the names or anything like that, that they were just a commodity for them. The next letter is actually relating to Jamaica. It's from Fulham Papers. And then this is a letter from Louis de Bonneval, who was the rector of the St. Thomas in the East in Jamaica. He managed to convert a few enslaved people, but that was met with opposition from the governor of Jamaica of that time, Trelawney. And then the rector was accused of preaching sedition because simply for the fact that he told his converts about the need of observing the Sunday, the day of the Lord, and then for the authorities of Jamaica, it was almost like an inspiration for disobedience to the masters. Another letter, which is really a voice from the archives, that's why I called the presentation Voices from the Archives, is a petition from Esther Smith, who was an enslaved woman brought to London from New York by her owner, and then she was seeking to be baptized, although her owner disagreed with that, and he intended to sell her to work in plantations, which she was trying to avoid. There is a very interesting and really moving surrounding correspondence to that letter, illustrating her story. Someone wrote that petition for her because she couldn't write. However, we don't know if she succeeded in avoiding being sent to the plantations. Just two more items. This is this infamous so-called slave Bible. It was published by the Christian Faith Society in 1808, right after the abolition of the slave trade, and it's a particularly horrific example, I think, in terms of how the Word of God was treated, because it was heavily edited. As you can see, 90% of the Old Testament has been removed, 50% of the New Testament have been removed, and a lot of passages relating to references to freedom and escape from slavery were removed. So, for instance, it jumps between Genesis to Exodus 19, and then it does include the 10 Commandments, but the first 18 books of Exodus, in which the Israelites escaped slavery in Egypt, have been removed from that edition. And then finally, I would like to give a voice to one of the enslaved people. This is a anonymous petition written in 1723 from an enslaved person in Virginia. However, it was wrongly filed in the volume for Jamaica. And then we don't know who wrote it, but it's written in their hand, and it was sent to London, to the Archbishop of London, asking for help and for religious education as well. So what I'll do, I'll just play it for you, because I think my talking would really not be that much showing what it was as this recording. Just bear with me.
August the 4th, 1723. To the Right Reverend Father in God, my Lord Archbishop of Lond, this comes to satisfy your honour that there is in this land of Virginia a sort of people that is called mulattoes, which are baptized and brought up in the way of the Christian faith, and follows the ways and rules of the Church of England. And some of them has white fathers, and some white mothers. And there is in this land a law or act which keeps and makes them and their seed slaves forever. And most honoured Sir, amongst the rest of your charitable acts and deed, we, your humble and poor partitioners, do beg, Sir, your aid and assistance in this one thing, which lies, as I do understand, in your lordship's breast, which is that your honour will, by the help of our sovereign Lord King George and the rest of the rulers, will release us out of this cruel bondage. And this we beg for Jesus Christ's his sake, who has commanded us to seek first the kingdom of God, and all things shall be added unto us. And here it is to be noted that one brother is a slave to another, and one sister to another, which is quite out of the way. And as for me, myself, I am my brother's slave, but my name is secret. And here it is to be noted again that we are commanded to keep holy the Sabbath day, and we do hardly know when it comes for our taskmasters are as hard with us as the Egyptians was with the children of Israel. God be merciful unto us. Here follows our severity and sorrowful service. We are hard used up on every account. In the first place, we are in ignorance of our salvation, and in the next place, we are kept out of the church, and matrimony is denied us. And to be plain, they do look no more up on us than if we were dogs, which I hope when these strange lines comes to your lordship's hands will be looked into. And here we beg for Jesus Christ, his sake, that as your honour do hope for the mercy of God at the day of death, and the redemption of our Saviour Christ, that when this comes to your lordship's hands, your honour will take some pity of us, who is your humble but sorrowful petitioners. And sir, we, your humble petitioners, do humbly beg the favour of your lordship, that your honour will grant and settle one thing upon us, which is that our children may be brought up in the way of the Christian faith. And our desire is that they may be learned the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and the 10 Commandments, and that they may appear every Lord's Day at church before the curate to be examined. For our desire is that godliness should abound amongst us, and we desire that our children be put to school and learn to read through the Bible, which is all at present with our prayers to God for its good success. Before your honour, these from your humble servants in the Lord. My writing is very bad. I hope your honour will take the will for the deed. I am but a poor slave that write it, and has no other time but Sunday, and hardly that at sometimes. September the 8th, 1723. To the Right Reverend Father in God, my Lord Archbishop of London, these with care. We dare not subscribe any man's name to this, for fear of our masters. For if they knew that we have sent home to your honour, we should go near to swing upon the gallows tree.
I won't add anything to it apart from the fact that just to say that we don't know if any reply or any action was done to that petition. Just a few words about further resources. I would like to encourage you to look at the guides we've produced, and then also search our online catalog, where I said the data from Queen's Own Bounty ledgers have been uploaded, and also to look at the books catalog, and then maybe those interested browse our digitized collections. If you have any questions, I'm happy to share my email address with you, and also my colleague Charmaine Simpson, who works for the response group. You can also access the full report on the Queen's Own Bounty links to the African chattel enslavement via those links, and then the Church of England response. Thank you so much for listening, and then I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're just going to go a little longer so that we can, in fact, take some of the very many questions that are coming in. Let me put the first to Archbishop Welby. And we have a lot of questions coming in, Archbishop. People very curious about the fund, as you can imagine. So I'll just combine 2 questions here. Tana is asking for an update on the fund and how it will be used. And Pat Bryan of the Repair Campaign, Brian Royce, is asking whether the money pledged by the Church of England would be administered to affected communities only in Jamaica, or also to descendants of affected communities in other Caribbean countries where the Church of England also had a hand.
The second question I'll take, it's coming along as far as I know. Well, the decision to pay the money has been taken, and it will be done at £10 million per year into a fund that is intended to be permanent, and the income from which will be used accordingly. As to where it will go, that will largely be in the hands, that will be in the hands of the Oversight Committee that will decide. It's not only for Jamaica, it's for the Caribbean and also West Africa, and the large majority of the Oversight Committee are either descendants of enslaved people or people, for example, in West Africa. I think the Archbishop of West Africa is one of those on the committee. I can't remember if Archbishop Gregory is. No. So that's basically how it's going. I have absolutely no role in deciding where the money goes, quite rightly.
Thank you so much. Question from Patrick Reed. I'll put to Professor Shepherd first of all, but anyone else can jump in after. He's asking, could someone please explain what's on the agenda for reparatory justice that seeks to address how we may re-educate our people towards economic independence, self-identity, and self-determination? Could we move the mic down, please?
Thank you. What I would say is that if we all could go to the CARICOM Reparation Commission website and look online for the 10-point plan, not just the 10 points listed, but the elaboration of each point. The issue of education is really explained. And one of the things we are recommending to the various ministers of education across the Caribbean is what we call curriculum reform, because we have to continue that process of decolonizing the curriculum or the curricula across our countries in order to ensure that we have a more liberating knowledge of self. And that's what we're trying to do in terms of education. The plan also speaks to a development plan, of course, with suitable cash based on how many schools we need. We need equality in our education system. So we're talking about ensuring that we have quality education across our regions, not just the kind of ranking game that we play at the moment. So I think that plan, that 10-point plan and its elaboration will answer that question fully.
Thank you, Prof. I should just say there is a microphone at the back. So if anybody in the room wants to ask a question, you can just go straight to the microphone so we can save some time here. Another question for Archbishop Welby. I'm trying to mix them up, but they are whole heap. So this one from Father Bertram Gale, himself an Anglican priest, and he asks, after 200 years, many consider the local Anglican Church to be stubbornly English in its general practice of worship. Or from your perspective, how can the quest for reparatory justice intersect with decolonizing or Jamaicanizing the local church?
I will resist the urge to be mischievous, since I have bishops sitting in front of me. The key point there about the Anglican Communion is that we have very largely decolonized the Anglican Communion. So the Archbishop of Canterbury has each province of the Anglican Church, 42, 43 provinces, is autonomous and makes its own decisions on such things as liturgy. I am not in any sense a pope at all, and therefore I cannot give instructions, which I'm very pleased about that fact, to any other province. I can't really even give them in my own very often. And So I think that is a question, Father, to be addressed to the leaders of the church in the West Indies. Rather like Rome, Anglican liturgy is a family character. It has different languages, but similar principles around the world. And it is really important that in each area that the local province decides on its own way forward. In other words, I'm not going to try and answer the question very well.
I would, though, like one of the gentlemen in the room to give a perspective on that. Archbishop. Okay, Archbishop Gregory steps up to bat. And just
I think that's known in the rugby world as a hospital pass, Archbishop.
Again, just reminding our viewers online to keep those questions coming in. Yes.
Thank you very much. Just to say that the process of indigenization is one that covers several areas. We've spoken about indigenization of clergy. The liturgy, we have developed, for example, a hymn book as a province, which, as far as I know, we were the leaders in terms of the incorporation of things written by Caribbean people, things by some of our popular pop artists as well. And some people wonder whether we are going local in doing that. In terms of the music that is used, we are using far more of our Caribbean rhythms and what have you. But the structure of liturgy, as the Archbishop has explained, there is something about our liturgy and the family character is maintained. The expression of it in terms of music, what we do, that is an ongoing process. And I believe that we have certainly, Bishop Reed, as we have mentioned earlier, was very heavily involved in the hymnal, but also we have a Caribbean liturgy, prayer book, which I think reflects something of the character, not just of Jamaica, but of the Caribbean. It's an ongoing movement, and we also expect the young clergy to inform that in going forward as well, shaping the future of Caribbean liturgy. Okay.
Thank you so much. Patrick Reed asked, and I'll throw this generally, anyone can take this one up. Can the combined and continuing evils of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism be brought to an end without consideration of a united Pan-African approach?
That's another pass.
That's another hospital.
The simple answer is no. And that is why if you consult the PJ Patterson Institute for Africa Caribbean Advocacy and the work they do, and also the work of the National Council on Reparation Jamaica, the CARICOM Reparation Commission, the Center for Reparation Research, and the writings, and the Africa Day, all the speeches from Africa Day will tell you that the movement now is for a united approach to reparation. In other words, we will be stronger when all those affected by this evil unite. And that unification is happening right now. Maybe a few years ago, especially in 2001 at the Durban Conference, the people would criticize and say African leaders chose, and those who were represented at the conference on racism in Durban, chose bilateralism instead of uniting with the Caribbean advocates who were there on the ground in Durban. The situation has changed, and many African leaders are now coming forward to say they are in the reparation movement. Actually, just in June, I was invited to launch what was called a reparation hub in one of the universities, University of the Free State in Africa. So it's happening, and I think it will just intensify.
Question for Justice Robinson from Patrick Lyle. He says, it sounds as if, Justice, you want the church to acknowledge illegality, which it will not and cannot do because it would open it to outside claims. Patrick says you're asking for the guardian not to be untied and the church is too smart to untie it. He's asking if you would settle on recompense, saying the church can embrace recompense as a construct.
But I'm not sure what is meant by recompense. It seems to me that the position is fairly simple and straightforward. Reparations are prompted by a legal obligation. Reparatory justice, the term that is being used, is not, and the church is involved in the latter. If you, for example, were to read the paper prepared by the USPG, the statement that I have referred to, it's about 3 pages. And in those 3 pages, you will see a reference to moral, probably about 4 times, But that's not what we want. We want reparations, which is a legal response to a wrong that was committed against our ancestors. Now, the Archbishop said he's not a lawyer, but he has lawyers who can advise him, probably better equipped than I am in international law. So I don't doubt that the church is up to the task of recognizing that what our ancestors suffered was a legal wrong, not just a moral wrong. It was a moral wrong, of course, but it was essentially a legal wrong. And you see it recognized in the 2 treaties that I referred to, the Treaty of Ghent between Great Britain and the USA in 1813, in which they acknowledged that the slave trade was irreconcilable with the principle of humanity. And then in 1814, not just 2, but 4, those 2 plus, I think, Netherlands and Portugal and Spain, they recognized that men of all ages, they said, have considered the slave trade as repugnant to the principle of humanity. And I'm saying that this is something which is normative. And I've written more at length about it. And in the lecture which I gave last year to Professor Shepard's committee, I developed it and showed that there's a connection, in my view at any rate, between that principle and what I call the greatest development in international law since 1945, which is the growth of a corpus of law based on a recognition of respect for the inherent dignity and worth of the human being. So it didn't just start in 1945. Yeah? And let me tell you why. In 1950, the first case that the ICJ heard was a case brought by the UK against Albania. And the UK's claim was that Albania breached the 1899 and 1907 laws of war by failing to remove mines from their seas and thereby exposing a British ship to be destroyed, and somebody was killed. And the court said, no, you can't rely on those laws because that was warfare. This is 1950. It's not warfare, it's peace. But what was breached was the elementary considerations of humanity, more exacting in peace than in war. So this is not an airy-fairy principle. The court found that Albania was in breach, its responsibility was engaged. And so I believe that there is an interconnectedness between that principle, elementary principle of humanity, and the principle of humanity, which we see referred to in those two instruments.
I see Professor Shepard trying to jump in.
Yeah. Well, when you are finished, I just want to seek your cooperation a little. In my haste, remember I was going at Usain Bolt pace, I omitted 4 lines, and it's very, very important. And I'd like your permission to just read them.
Yeah, sorry, Dion. I just want to clarify in case people are wondering which is the committee that I have. I think Judge is referring to the fact that I was chair at the time of his presentation of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Just want to clarify that.
Just while you have the mic, and before I go to a question on the floor, someone is asking, a viewer is asking, Prof, given Justice Robinson's clear explanation of the difference between reparatory justice and reparations, should we drop the terminology and concept of reparatory justice?
I have to yield to the knowledge and experience of Judge Robinson. And I think more and more people are using reparation, and some people use reparations. So I think it's wise counsel.
And we have Naomi, who is from St. Hugh's, who is going to be asking a question. She's here with us in the room, and go ahead.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Yes, I was gonna say my school and my name, but it was already done already. I would like to first say that undoubtedly, I know that everyone here must be hearing the passion that is coming from each presenter in different ways and in different forms. Personally, Shepherd, I have read many of your writings. I'm a history student, and I was so inspired and excited actually when I saw you step up. I was like, wow. And going straight into my question is directed towards the bishop, and it is, what specific actions is the church taking in this moment to address the economic and social disparities which have been caused by slavery in its historical marginalized communities? And as a young person, how exactly do you intend to target our audience to ensure that we are able to be informed about these actions, and not only informed, but to also be a part of this movement towards unity and equality amongst us all?
Not a hospital pass.
Everything, if you're Archbishop, everything's a hospital pass. Thank you very much indeed. It's a really good question. The list is huge, and I want to be brief to leave more room for other people. One of the main things we're doing at the moment, because we can't do everything, is identify key areas where we can make a difference. Around the world, we have, I don't know how many, but some tens of thousands of schools. And we have well over 100 universities in different countries, some very new, some much more established. One of the key things we started 2 years ago was an Anglican community network on science, which looks at the next 40 years. It's led by people mainly from the Global South. And in fact, it'll be meeting here in September in Jamaica. It was going to be 2 weeks ago, but for obvious reasons, people were unable to get here. The Anglican, its vision is to enable the enormous changes in science and technology over the next 40 years, A, to be put in a moral and ethical framework, and B, to be shared equally around the world, so as not to create a new form of the differentials of wealth and power, which in the 19th century and 18th century prevailed in making slavery possible, which is the threat we are facing over the next 40 years. That would be one example. There are numerous others, but that's one in particular.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Naomi. Naomi is sixth form at St. Hugh's, the Swans. Okay, I'm going to be giving our panelists final wrap-up comments, but before that, Justice Robinson had asked us to add something.
Yes. It relates to the 18 million Barbados dollars, which I said is inadequate. And this is probably a matter that should be addressed by our own Archbishop Gregory. What I left out was the following. It is noted that the church has an amalgamated endowment fund, which has financial assets in excess of 10 billion pounds. This results from the amalgamation of the Queen Anne's Bounty Fund and the Ecclesiastical Commissioners Fund in 1948. And these have now been placed under the control of the church commissioners. So what I'm saying is that the sum of 18 million is really, I'm sorry to say, like a joke, joke. And the church has funds, and the church must step up and meet its obligations under international law.
Thank
But
you.
it's not really the church, it's a trust. It's a trust. But as you see, I've said that the trust is an entirely church-dominated institution. There's no attempt to hide it. You have 7 members, 5 appointed by the church and 2 by the minister with responsibility for ecclesiastical affairs. And it is always chaired by someone like our own national hero.
Got the point. Thank you so much, Justice. And final comments. Let me start with you, Professor. Oh, go ahead, Archbishop.
I'm chairman of that trust. And therefore, I just want to respond. I have not a difficulty with you. I have a difficulty with the very program itself, which I expressed from the outset. But the trust is set up, and Errol Barrow, former Prime Minister, was one who determined the shape of that trust. The government of Barbados has 2 representatives on that body, and the church has on it not just clerics, but it has on it people from different sectors, whether it's business, law. We have a lawyer from Barbados, so there are different persons that involve it. There are 2 different entities working at the moment. The church commissioners, which is the ones that control that sum that is mentioned, USPG, which functions, it's related, but it functions with a different financial base, a different level of administration. And part of the challenge, which I find for me, is how to embrace that particular initiative as an almost competing entity rather than working alongside the broader Church of England project. So it's a difficulty which I certainly wrestle with as chairman of the trust.
Thank you so much, Archbishop. Professor Bryan, final comments from you?
No, I've been here to learn, and I have been learning. My contribution was a little bit parochial, so it got sunk in the wider dimensions of reparation, reparatory justice, and all that. But it has been useful for me. Thank you.
Thank you, but I won't let you downgrade your presentation like that. I certainly also learned significantly from it. So thank you very much, Professor Shepherd.
Glad you told Professor Bryan that, because historical context is everything before you can move on to the other issues. Okay, quickly, a few things. Well, let me start with our student, because our student is here. I want to encourage her and others at her school to engage in language deconstruction. I know you have heard some words and terms here that we're trying not to use anymore. Slaves. Our people were enslaved. They were not natural. You have to put the blame where it was. So enslaved. We talk about modern day trafficking, while we don't talk about historical trafficking, while we say slave trade. And it's not just slavery, it's chattel enslavement. So I want to encourage that. That's one. The other thing, to the archivist, I'm hoping, it's very expensive to go to the UK for our students to consult archives. They are digitized, but I hope we don't have to pay to get access to the digitized documents. I hope.
No. This is all.
So this is great. I'm
online.
Happy to hear that. Okay, let's hope it's an example to other archives because I've had to pay good money for documents, including the compensation records from the archives. And you will tell me that UCL database is there, doesn't have the kind of details that the Treasury records have out at Kew. Two other things. During the franchise movement years ago in the United States, there was a saying, nothing about us without us. And I'm concerned that some are being bandied around, but not in all cases, we the victims have been asked what sum of money is enough. Now we have quantification here done by the Battle Group and Judge Robinson. So I would hope that the people are involved, Rastafari, those who started the movement, are involved in this, what is being bandied about as the payment. And then I want us to remember that reparations started before us at the head table here, and the advocates, in the room. I want us to remember that as emancipation is coming up, right? That the anniversary of emancipation, that the anti-slavery activists here with boots on the ground must always be kept in mind. And finally, enslaved Africans had an idea of what they were worth. And I want to quickly read an extract from Jordan of the United States. When emancipation came, he and his wife, Mandy, were asked to go back to work for the enslaver. This is what he said: "Sir, if you will write and say what wages you will give me, I will be better able to decide whether it will be in my advantage to move back again. And we have concluded to test your sincerity by asking you to send us our wages for the time we served you. I have served you faithfully for 32 years, and my wife, Mandy, 20 years. At $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy, gender discrimination. Our earnings would amount to $11,680. Add to this, the interest for the time our wages have been kept back, and deduct what we paid for doctor's visits. Send the money by Adams Express." Just saying.
Thank you, Prof. Mr. Adam, do you want to make a quick final comment?
I just wanted to say thank you for that attention. And as Professor Shepard mentioned, historic context is very important, and archives are providing that context. So I would like to encourage everyone to research, find more evidence, and it's not only Lambeth Palace Library, but archives across the world and across the United Kingdom. And thank you for today.
Thank you so much. Justice?
I was just asked. Oh, okay. Oh, justice, you said. Sorry. I thought I'm a bit deaf. I thought you said justice.
That's okay. That was coming to you, Archbishop.
Well, I'm not a justice. I'm Patrick Robinson. I demitted office as a judge on the 2nd of February. So Patrick Robinson, please. One of the things that I don't think we have been able to grapple with and to settle with any degree of satisfaction is the effect of the Codrington Trust on all of this. The relationship between the Codrington Trust and the obligations of the government of Barbados. I had to go back to my law school days and read up on trust, I think it's really a fairly simple instrument. You have the act, and the clearest thing in the act is that the trust has the liability for the obligations of the USPG before it inherits those obligations. But apart from that, I don't see anything in it, for example, about how the descendants of the enslaved are to be treated. It's not a trust that has beneficiaries. I think it's more like a purpose trust. And so in my view, I think the body that is to look to the interests of the descendants of the enslaved, and that it's really the government of Barbados. And so I ask myself 4 questions.
Remember, it's closing comments.
It's comments? It's comments? All right, okay. But I believe that apart from the first question which I asked, which is who is to pay the reparations for the wrongs of the church? And that answer is the trust, and it's given by the Trust Act itself. But all the other answers that I have, to whom are the reparations to be paid? They have to be paid to the government of Barbados. Well, the trust can't pay it to itself, you know. And who is to determine the quantum of the reparations? Well, the quantum of the reparations that are to be determined by the government of Barbados, it seems to me, in consultation with the trust relating to the wrongs of the church. But insofar as the church is an organ of the state of the United Kingdom, then those consultations will have to be with the United Kingdom. You know?
All right, we're going to have to bring you back for a whole lecture on the trust. Archbishop, let me give you the final word before I ask Archbishop Gregory to.
Thank you. As I hoped, I've learned a great deal, and particularly the distinctive importance between reparatory justice and reparations. I remain slightly unconvinced there because I think law is a very blunt instrument. I did study law, and there are no international lawyers, as far as I know, employed by the Church of England. By the way, we have enough trouble with canon law. But I think reparatory justice is a more flexible and in the absence of binding legal decisions that have impact in the United Kingdom or in England, reparatory justice is a broader and more flexible way of compelling the moral duty of bodies to consider their obligations. As a trustee of the Church Commissioners, though a non-active one, trustee by custom and by history, I know that and as a trustee of numerous other bodies which go with the job, I know that we have no obligation to pay things as trustees unless it is pursuant to the needs and the objects of the trust in English law. I'm constantly being told that. And if there is a court judgment against us, obviously that must be paid. The trouble is, I think, with the kind of reparations approach, is that there is no court that has legally binding jurisdiction in England apart from English courts. Now, if a case is brought in an English court and they make a decision either against USPG or against the Church Commissioners or against the United Kingdom government, that is obviously binding. But in the absence of a definitive judgment after appeals, that nothing is binding. The case in the Corfu Channel case, which was 1950, which you referred to, Justice, in fact, Albania never paid anything because the court couldn't bind it. And therefore, although the court said that it was wrong for Albania not to have, I remember reading the judgment, it was wrong for Albania not to have removed the mines, and hence leading to the severe damage and one sinking of Royal Naval vessels passing through the Corfu Channel. Although the court said that, it couldn't be enforced because the Albanian government of the time simply said, no, we're not going to pay any attention to that. We have the same problem with numerous other ICJ judgments. Reparative justice imposes a moral obligation, and that can, God willing, lead to legal obligations in due course. As we have seen in cases like Rwanda genocide and the Arusha court and others. That's my first point. The second is just, again, if we're staying in the legal sphere, people can hide behind different corporate personalities. USPG is not controlled by the Church of England. being president is a purely honorary role. It has no legal impact at all. I'm not a trustee. The Church of England, the church commissioners are not controlled by the British government. And my fear with a legal approach of reparations is that until a court says, well, despite the fact you don't control them, we're going to look through the corporate veil, the answer is going to be from all the lawyers, oh, well, we have no obligation because there is no legal obligation because it was done by a separate legal personality over which we do not have control, which is certainly true for the British government and the Church of England. That I do know because it's part of my job to make sure that it's true, because we don't want the government telling us what to do. And so that is, I prefer reparatory justice, in which, to my mind, includes the concept of reparations, so that one way or another, those who have moral obligations have to face up to them, whether for legal reasons or out of conscience.
Thank you so much.
No,
I have to wrap.
Right.
I do have to wrap. Archbishop Gregory, can you just come up and, okay, no. And I'm just going to bowl one last ball as you come, because a viewer is asking if someone could respond to Professor Shepherd's comments about the monuments to enslavers in the church and whether the diocese, as part of its celebrations, perhaps would look at removing them.
Just to respond by saying that I raised that question in the synod we had after the first synod during COVID, that is an issue which we have to face. But it's not something I can run into. I raised through the question that is something we have to engage and to see how we will respond to it. But I raise it because I see it staring us in the face. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Well, this has certainly been, we did anticipate as in the planning process that this was going to be what it is. And so in that sense, we are excited. So thank you so much. My task, Bishop Minor, the Bishop of Kingston, chair of the planning committee, and I'm just to say thanks. What a wonderful discussion we have had. First off, I wish to say thanks to Archbishop Howard for thinking it's his idea. He feels that we could not go through this celebration without engaging the subject. It is in the public domain, certainly here in Jamaica, and therefore, as a church, we could not escape the discourse. And so we have participated, and we will continue to participate in it. Thanks, Mrs. Moderator. You lived up to our expectation. Thank you very much. You guided the discussion expertly. Thanks to the very erudite panelists, Professor Patrick Bryan, Professor Vereen Shepherd. I have in my notes Justice Patrick Robinson, but I'm going to say Patrick Robinson. And Christophe Adamaze of the Lambeth Palace Library and the archivist, and of course to the Most Reverend Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury. We thank you very much for gracing us with your presence and for really creating and maintaining this vibrant discussion. I would like to recognize and to say thanks to Ms. Cecile Clayton. I'm just going to ask her to stand and ask you to give her a round of applause. She's not more special than the others, but once the Archbishop and I agreed that this should be a subject for discussion, I called her because we worked together in another life, and I knew she could pull this off in an expert fashion, and she did. So thank you, Cecile. And she has a team ably supported by Miss Ava Haynes and my secretary, Dion Daniel, who just came on board, Mr. Carlton Samuels, Mrs. Carol Edwards, Mr. Glenroy Dixon, and Mr. Jovan Johnson, who is in the room. Yes, he's here. Thank you so much for your commitment and stick-to-itiveness in this process. Thanks to our sponsors, Jamaica National and Grace Kennedy Foods, for their generous donations in cash and kind. Hearty thanks to our caterer, Mrs. Jeanette Hutchinson for preparing and presenting a tasty refreshment on the outside, and we're inviting you afterwards, please, to join us. But some of us are gonna have to rush off elsewhere. We also thank the University of the West Indies for hosting us at this regional headquarters. Such a beautiful setting. We give special thanks to the technical team, Miss Clavia Watson-Reed, the social media coordinator at Church House, as well as Miss Justine Harrison and Mr. Stephen McEwan, here at the regional headquarters, Mr. Mondo Townsend, for ensuring that the technical connections worked with precision. Thanks to Ms. Beverly Newell for assisting with the publicity and public relations for this event, and of course, other events for the anniversary. We thank the media for the pre-publicity related to the webinar, and hopefully we look forward to engaging the media in post events to this webinar and the anniversary events. I'd like to recognize, though recognized previously, Miss Miller, Naomi Miller from St. Hugh's High School, retired Justice Hilary Phillips, yes, Justice Zayla McCullough, retired Justice Zayla McCullough, who is also Chancellor of the Diocese, the Chairman of the Financial Board, Mr. Wayne Powell, our Diocesan Secretary, Mrs. Mighty, she's still there. And I'd like to acknowledge colleague members of the clergy in the audience, Canon Michael Allen, Reverend Natalie Blake, Professor Veron Sachel, Bishop, I almost say Archbishop, Bishop Philip Wright from Belize, and of course, Bishop Leon Golding, my colleague, Bishop of Montego Bay. And of course, we have the entourage with Archbishop Welby, Sophie, and Tosin, and Neil. No, Neil is not here. Good to have you. Last but not least, we thank you as audience for your participation, attentiveness. You help very much to add to the energy in the room. Thank you so much. It is hoped that this discussion will continue and lead to healing and better understanding of the historical and historic human tragedy of chattel enslavement. Thanks again to everyone for your participation. And in these matters, you know, we always leave out someone. So thank you, nevertheless, if I did not call your name. Thanks again very much, and God bless you. And I'd like to say the benediction, but I will wait for the moderator to tell me if I can go ahead. If you are able, please stand. The peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God and of his Son, Jesus Christ. The blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be with you and remain with you this day and forevermore. Amen. God bless you all. Very much.